brethren and friends, this is my rest forever. Here will I dwell, for I have desired it. I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety. Believing and trusting in the love of an almighty God, and as true Masons, having a firm reliance in the immortality of the soul, we are gathered here today for the purpose of rededicating the gravestone of the Honorable Walter Murray, standing as a proper tribute to his useful and noteworthy life. It again rises above the place of his last sleep, he having gone before us to that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. Dr. Dan Krieger, Professor Emeritus of History from Cal Poly State University, will now help us return to October 8th, 1875, for a better understanding of the life and times of our brother, Walter Murray.
Thanks, Robert. It is a very great honor to be here today with you, and also, as I will note, a matter of personal closure for something that is long overdue, and I am so grateful to the members of the King David Masonic Lodge for taking on this task, and especially to past Grand Master Robert, who has spearheaded the whole operation here. Walter Murray is truly, if I had to single any individual in all of the history of San Luis Obispo who made this community what it is, it'd be Walter Murray. Having said that, I would find him a pretty tough hombre to deal with. He was definitely a survivor. The very fact that someone born in the midst of the Industrial Revolution in London would end up 9,000 miles away in what was a very remote pioneer community speaks for itself. And yet here he is, buried amongst the other pioneers of the family, and so many of these other graves around us, I think particularly Judge McDowell Venable's grave, are reasons why he was here and why he made a difference in the history of San Luis Obispo County. Murray, as I indicated, was born in the Industrial Revolution. And he was born, he would be a generation after Charles Dickens, but things had not gotten much better, particularly if you were not amongst the wealthy elite in England and went to the proper schools and got networked into the Oxford-Cambridge University Society. If you weren't in that group, there wasn't much room for you to really grow in your life. And it's why so many of our ancestors left European society to come to America, because of the social mobility. And Murray recognized this. At the time Murray was growing up, he was exposed to a legal education, probably a far better legal education than Abraham Lincoln was able to get. He was actually apprenticed to one of the top London solicitors, and he studied law, mingling around the Inns of Court and the Royal Law Courts, where he would meet some of the most prominent solicitors and barristers of his era. And I have no doubt that he sat in on some of the trials of that time, if only as a beginning or apprentice clerk. He would have been exposed to the type of rhetoric that you and I were privileged to see in the Rumpel of the Bailey series that is on public television. And he understood the nature of law. He, very much like Rumpel, he once told his daughter, Anita Murray, who related to her daughter, my dear friend and my adoptive, and Liz's adoptive mother, Dorothy Bilodeau, who's buried at the foot of the grave here, that the practicing law, particularly the criminal law, is like being a taxi owner at a taxi rack where taxis line up, and in England it's a bit different from here in America. You see taxis all lined up, and if the first one is vacant, you hop in that, and that is your taxi. the taxi driver by law, if he doesn't want to lose his license, can't refuse you. He has to take you on board. And my brother-in-law, who's a criminal defense lawyer, smiling at me right now, you get whatever hops in, don't you, David? And it's not always pleasant. But that's a principle of law, and we're here to thank the Almighty that we have that kind of law. Liz and I just spent some time in a wonderful country in China with our adoptive son, Wei Jun Song, and his family. But things don't operate that equitably in China. If you're a criminal in China, you're a criminal because the state says you're so. You're rounded up, you're paraded around the country without necessarily a trial, and at a given moment you're forced to kneel down, and they put a bullet in the back of your head, and they send your family a bill for the cost of the bullet. Slightly different. Murray was part of the Anglo-American tradition. And when he came to America, I think he had in mind eventually becoming an attorney. But he could do something else. He could write well. And we now know through researches that I've done that while he was in New York, he apprenticed at several publishing companies, including the company that just a few years later, after Murray left, brought out the popular magazine Popular Mechanics. And he knew that literature was something that could be sold to the ordinary classes. They would buy it because in America, if you had the instructions on how to do something, you could do it for yourself if you couldn't afford to have somebody else do it for you. Another story that he told to his daughter, who passed it on to Dorothy, who passed it on to Liz and to me. His exposure to the popular press in New York. It was the time when the press wars were just heating up in the decade and a half before the American Civil War. The rotary press had just come in, making it possible, instead of publishing 500 copies, to publish 5,000 or 50,000 or even 500,000 copies of something was now there available. And he realized that the press was a motivator in a democratic society. It was where the ordinary person got his information, and the direction of that press could seriously influence the way people voted. And he followed that, living here in California, but he followed the press wars that anticipated the American Civil War. And as an Englishman, as a free Englishman, he very quickly sympathized with the side. How could democracy persist when people were still enslaved within its bounds? The constitutional fathers had never been able to face that dilemma, but now it was coming to a crux, and Walter Murray became part of that argument here in California. He came to San Luis Obispo in a rather circuitous way. In New York, a infantry officer in the New York National Guard at the beginning of the Mexican-American War quickly formed Stevenson's regiment, the New York 1st Volunteers. And he offered passage to California. He personally funded the hiring of ships to take his regiment to California. It was a very odd lot that boarded that ship, including the two principal characters in the cast of the Vigilante Committee of 1858 that occurred here later, that Walter Murray was to become the leader of the Vigilance Committee, and his nemesis would be a man named Jackie Powers, who had just immigrated from Ireland and gotten on the same ship. They undoubtedly met one another many times, may have shared a drink. They both were in Santa Barbara approximately the same time where Stevenson's regiment was landed. The only actual combat fighting that the regiment engaged in was in Mazatlan, Mexico, where Walter Murray and Jackie Powers were both slightly wounded. They both probably contracted malaria, which stayed with them for the rest of their lives. But then they were sent on to Santa Barbara. They sailed into Santa Barbara to occupy the city, which Fremont had just recaptured. And they were told the Mexican-American War is now over. Andres Pico has surrendered. The Californianos were at peace, and Walter Murray decided to explore this new territory, which clearly was about to become American. He headed up to the magnet for most Californians in those days, Yerba Buena, which was being renamed San Francisco, when a man named Sam Brannan, a Mormon renegade, came into town and got very, very drunk and ran up and down the Barbary Coast shouting, there's gold in them thar hills." Brannan had a reason for doing that. He controlled almost all the shovels and picks and various other things that were available, and had bought up almost all the good farming land in the California Delta, where Brannan Island is still one of the major islands, and he did indeed become a very, very rich man. What was Walter Murray to do but to go into the gold rush? He went to Sonora, and he saw how hard mining for gold was. And he looked at his hands, and his hands were not those of a miner. They were the hands of a legal clerk. And he decided, these are the guys that are getting the money, so that's what I want to do. And he proceeded to try to restudy law. He supported himself editing several gold rush newspapers. But then also he began to see a lot of shoot-em-ups in the gold fields, and he was not happy with that at all. And he realized in the end the gold was going to be controlled by those people who had the assets to go into big-time mining. So he tried to find a town where he could settle. He came to San Luis Obispo in part because we were a major business center in California. The Argonauts, the minor 49ers, had to be fed, and San Luis Obispo was the center of the mission cattle industry. Cattle were shipped from here, marched overland to the San Joaquin River, and shipped down the river to California's fat city, Stockton, where they were fattened up on beer mash, and then they were taken on barges, on power barges, up to the mother lode towns of Sonora, Columbia, Jamestown, so on and so forth. And San Luis Obispans were getting very, very rich. He settled here in 1853, coming down from San Francisco by ship. When he arrived at the seaport, which was not Port San Luis, but simply a little stoppage right off the end of what is now the Avila Wharf, and the captain said, "You'll have to wade on shore. There's only one passenger who's going on shore. I'm not going to put a boat in the water," so he had to wade on shore. As he got down into the water very gingerly, wondering how deep it was, the captain threw the mail bags at him and said, "While you're at it, take these into San Luis. Here's the U.S. mail." Murray wrote about this later to a newspaper in San Francisco, and that scrap is now in the Bancroft Library in the Murray collection. He did not have a high opinion of San Luis Obispo. As he rode into town, after having to rent a horse from Manuel Avila, who probably is the cheapest man who ever lived in this county, he noted in the creek on 3 occasions human remains. On one occasion, a skeleton was tied to a tree with a rusted knife still in its rib cage. He wrote about that also for the newspapers in San Luis Obispo. He was not the best publicist for our town, was he? But once he got here, he decided to do something about it. He opened a legal practice, putting out his shingle. It was a very simple matter to get accredited to the state bar in those days, particularly when he could document his training. And he took on all clients, including Jackie Powers, including some of the very men he would later hang in the Committee of Vigilance Action. Ultimately, he began to talk to other town leaders, including a man who is related to Albert Forrest Jack, who's here at our feet, saying, you know, if we don't straighten out this town, we're not going to amount to nothing. We're going to be like those gold rush towns. When the price of gold is high, they're booming. When the price of gold is low, they're going to be dead. When the price of gold is high, the town will be filled with criminals. When the town is dead, nothing happens. What kind of life is that? That kind of talk got him into trouble with Powers. Powers fingered him for cartel assassination. The local cartel tried to assassinate him. Big mistake, as I wrote in my column. They tried to shoot up his house. He didn't give up. Then the leader of the gang said, "Who will be brave enough to go in and take out this stupid gringo?" Nobody went in. That left Walter Murray in charge. A few months later, almost all of the bandidos were either hung or in front of the mission, or they were shot out in the field in a shootout at Turry Road, where Murray was actually injured. Murray had played a major role in the Committee of Vigilance, but I think his main role will come later in 1861. In 1861, America went to war against itself, and the problem with Southern California was there were so many people from the southern states who had settled here. Some even brought their slaves with them, and the California Supreme Court had to release some of those slaves, and they were angry over that. They wanted the California, which was to be a free state when it came into the Union in September 1850, to renounce being a free state and to become a slave state. And there was serious talk in Southern California of secession. There was actually an act put before the Congress of the United States in 1859 to separate all of California south of the Monterey County line to form the territory of the Colorado, with San Luis Obispo as its capital. So we had a lot of unreconstructed Southerners here even before they needed reconstruction. And Murray was very wary of them. One of them is buried right next door, McDowell Venable, proud Virginian, first families of Virginia. His family was one of the families that arrived at Jamestown when it was founded. And while he himself did not believe in slavery, he thought it should be every man's free choice. Now, kind of an odd expression, isn't it? Every man's free choice to be in favor of slavery? Murray saw the error of his ways, and he wrote that McDowell was wrong, that California had to stay in the Union. And Murray joined Starr King, the Unitarian minister, who came through San Luis Obispo preaching sermons that essentially reiterated the lyrics to the battle hymn of the Republic, that the sin of slavery was slowly being squeezed out. The grapes of wrath were being destroyed, but with that, the grapes of slavery also had to be destroyed. And Murray was a very, very firm Unionist. His allegiance to the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. I don't know that he would stand with much of what the Republican Party seems to stand for today, because he believed there was a positive role for government. Government stood to do for the people what they could not do for themselves by themselves, but he also believed in cooperation. He talked to the Democratic McDowell Venable regularly. He was my friend. They shared drinks. We just don't share the same opinion about certain things. Well, in 1868, McDowell Venable got some Democratic slaveholder friends of his, former slaveholder friends, to start a newspaper here in San Luis Obispo. And this really freaked Walter Murray out. He said, something has to be done about this. And he said, McDowell, either you cease publication or I'll start a paper. And Walter Murray started a paper, and I'm proud to write for that paper now for 24, 25, 26 years, time goes. But the paper really stood for a free California. And even though it was 4 years after the end of the Civil War, matters were not yet resolved here. Murray started the Tribune. The Pioneer quickly folded, and it became Murray's paper. People began to say, Judge Murray, why don't you run for this new court office that has fallen vacant with the death of Pablo de la Guerra, judge of the 1st District. Now I want to tell you how big that 1st District was. It covered all of Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo counties, but in those days Santa Barbara County included Ventura County. It meant that he had to hold court in towns as distant as what is now Thousand Oaks, and all the way up on the San Luis Obispo County line at San Miguel. He realized his health was not particularly good. He began to have what he described as dyspepsia. We now know that he probably was beginning to suffer from the effects of an appendicitis that badly needed taking out. But bear in mind that operation was not very successful for most people, and he did not want to do what Dwight Eisenhower did while stationed in Panama in 1924, had his appendix taken out whether it needed it or not, just so it wouldn't be there to bother him. He didn't have those options. You pretty much were stuck with what you got, and Murray understood that. Nonetheless, he was required to hold sessions every 6 weeks in succeeding districts ranging again from San Miguel, what is now the Carrizo Plains, all the way south to the southern end of Ventura County. It was a bit much for him, and finally in 1875 his appendix ruptured and he died. He married a Chileno widow and had a daughter by that widow, and thank goodness he talked to that daughter a whole lot. Among other things, he said that he envisioned the day when women would get the right to vote. On Monday, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of women being granted the right to vote here in California. He fully appreciated the provisions in in California state law, which allow women to buy, own, and sell property, something they did not have in most of the other states. He was far ahead of his time in so many ways. He did worry about the future of San Luis Obispo. He said this town could go off-kilter very, very easily with the wrong kind of people. And of course, he had to deal with the wrong kind of people. His newspaper may be seen as merely a political organ, but I see it as more than that. He wanted an informed public. He wanted people to know what issues were before their very various representative bodies. And if it had not been for the Tribune, local government would not have emerged the way it did in an orderly fashion where everybody got a fair shake. When he heard about someone being taxed unfairly, another friend of his who's buried across the street in the Catholic cemetery, Captain William G. Dana, was the tax collector in San Luis Obispo for many years, and then that office was passed on to his son. Well, they tended to favor the old landholders over the newcomers, and Murray argued against that in the newspaper, saying everyone should pay their fair share of tax. There should be no unequal taxation. There again, he's ahead of some of us even today, isn't he? And he also was a great supporter for another person buried here in the cemetery, Dr. W.W. Hayes. Dr. Hayes is the founder of public health in San Luis Obispo County. He started our first general hospital, partly in response to Walter Murray's dilemma in 1875, when there was no decent hospital for Murray to go to. Murray had to go from his office down the street to a cheap hotel, the old French hotel, and he took a room upstairs and said, "Please don't bother my wife, it will break her up to see me suffering this way." His friends brought him a lot of brandy and laudanum to try to kill the pain. Laudanum is a tincture of morphine, and that was the way he died. I told you I had a personal connection to this through Dorothy Bilodeau, who was buried at the foot of the grave. Dorothy became our friend when I was elected by a freak act of fate, president of the County Historical Society in 1978. And we were told that this lady that lived in a place called the Judge's House, just when you go under the underpass there on Johnson Avenue, you look up and you see an old Victorian house. There's some developments around it. That was Dorothy's house. And that Dorothy was Walter Murray's granddaughter, and she could tell us a lot of stories. But nobody would go to her because everyone was afraid of her. She had a mouth like her grandfather did. She was, and if you look at a picture of Dorothy and a picture of Walter Murray in middle age, The jaw is the same. It is set. It's ready to deal with all the bastards of this world. You better believe it. Liz called Dorothy on the phone, and I was studying for my class the next day, and I heard Liz utter an expletive and slam the phone down. That was our first encounter with Dorothy. Liz doesn't normally cuss at all. She didn't cuss to Dorothy, but the next minute the phone rang back, and I answered it, and she said, "I can see you're my kind of people." And we became close friends. Later, when Dorothy was sick in the hospital, the nurses would try to separate Liz from Dorothy, but Dorothy said, "Let her stay here. She's the only reason I'm alive. I need this tank woman." But in the process, she told us a lot about her grandfather, and about her mother, and about her father, Judge Unanks, who had for the county of San Luis Obispo roughly the same judgeship that Walter Murray had for the Tri-Counties area. Judge Unanks, by the way, presided over the trial of Ah Louie's son, when one of Ah Louie's paper sons from China was found guilty of murdering, remember, young Lewis and the late Howard Lewis, when their mother was murdered in front of the store with this man. So Unanks had seen some of the worst of it also. But the legends were just amazing. To sit in the house built by Judge Unanks, listening to Judge Murray's granddaughter was one of the real gifts. It was the most unforgettable oral history I have ever taken down. The saddest moment for Dorothy in her whole life, she married into the Warden family, landowners in the Los Osos Valley. Are any Wardens here today? They're the descendants. That marriage did not last because Lou Warden was, as she said, a gambler and a womanizer, and a few other expletives we couldn't add. But she maintained a close relationship with the family. And she had to take over the raising of her sons. She had two sons, Lou and Murray, and she raised them by selling insurance during the Depression. She had a partnership with another man for a district that divided the Sacramento Valley into two areas. She took the southern Sacramento Valley, he had the northern Sacramento Valley. Sometimes they quarreled. Dorothy told me the perfect way to resolve a quarrel. You simply both go into a pharmacy, you get those little blue bottles that you take before a colonoscopy. Some of you know those bottles, huh? You both drink as much as you can, and the argument's over. I just wanted to give you that flavor of Dorothy. This monument bothered her terribly. She did not have much money. She was barely hanging on to the house by renting out rooms to Cal Poly students, building on places for Cal Poly students to stay after the Second World War. And she couldn't afford to repair the monument that was defaced in either 1960 or 1961. The base was seriously eroded, the top was knocked off, and Dorothy said, "Dan, promise me sometime before you go that'll be taken care of." Well, I've been distracted by a lot of things, but I think it's the kind of community that Walter Murray would have deeply admired. And I know Dorothy, who could be as filled with blessings. She taught us a song, "Count Your Blessings, Count Them Every One." Her blessings are coming down on the Masonic Order today. You have done the wonderful thing, and I hope that this monument will remain intact. One of the purposes that I give graveyard tours every Halloween for is to try to deflect the kind of vandalism that occurs in graveyards, and it seems to have worked. We have not had that kind of vandalism. The late Bob Kennedy told me shortly before his death that one of the saddest calls he had to make was to go with the Cal Poly police to a Cal Poly dorm room, and he saw about 4 or 5 grave markers there in the room that had been stolen from the cemetery. And he tried to tell the kids who had done this, "Don't you realize what you've done to the families and the memory of the person?" And he said they just had blank looks on their faces. Well, we need to change that, and this needs to stand as it is. And this whole cemetery is so historic. The Jewish cemetery itself is arguably the most historic Jewish cemetery in the state of California. It's one of the earliest. The Western Jewish Historical Quarterly has named it as the preeminent Jewish cemetery because it's so well documented and such. The Odd Fellows, an organization founded primarily to bury people in Western America, started this cemetery because if you were going west, you didn't know where you would be when you died, and you wanted to have a place to be buried. If you had an Odd Fellows card on you, the local chapter of the Odd Fellows had to bury you. They were a Masonic-like organization in that sense, and often we see them in tandem in community development. So there's so much that ties us all here together. But again, Dorothy, I'm glad your last prayer, she died in 1983 in Sierra Vista Hospital, but I'm glad her last prayer is with us and the grave has been restored. Walter Murray, who, this I believe, Robert, is from your files, the young Walter Murray. This is Walter Murray in the Masonic ceremony. You get some flavor of him from this picture that you don't from other portraits of him. Walter Murray stands tall, just as he's standing in this image today, as a tribute to the kind of community we aren't always, but we want to be. A kind of community that when it sees a need, stands up and takes action. Thank you very much.
And now at this place, which we today rededicate, we may well ponder on the mystery of death. And what a mystery! We are told by men wise in the philosophy of olden days that God never gives to man the key to the golden gate of eternity until his time shall come to enter there. Let us pray.
Our Heavenly Father, we humbly ask thy blessing in all the purposes of our present assembly. Support us, O Lord, through the long day of this troublous life, until the shadows lengthen and the busy world is hushed, until the fever of life is over and our work is done. Then of thy compassion grant us a safe and peaceful rest at the last. For thy mercy's sake. Amen.
Our time is in God's hand. When he taketh away our breath, we die, and our bodies turn to dust, but our spirits pass to life abundant in the glory of immortality. Such is the teaching of Freemasonry, and it is only the reiteration in symbolic instruction of that which is taught in the great light of Masonry, God's holy word. As Myron Angel observed in his History of San Luis Obispo County in 1883, Brother Murray's funeral was conducted by members of the Masonic Order. There were 86 Masons in the procession that accompanied the remains to the cemetery, with 315 others and 81 carriages, making one of the most impressive funerals ever witnessed in San Luis Obispo. Indeed, it must have been singularly impressive for a town of only 3,000 souls at that time. Friends, the members of King David's Masonic Lodge, Brother Murray's Lodge, sincerely thank you for attending this solemn event. Symbolically, you, Dr. Dan Krieger, have helped us rekindle the spirit of that bygone time, 136 years ago today. We now invite you to join us and Dr. Krieger for a tour of this old section of the cemetery where so many founders of our town and our lodge have been laid to rest. As we close our memorial to our dearly departed brother, Walter Murray, please bow your heads and pray with us.
The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face to shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift upon us the light of his countenance and give us peace. Amen.